You just press play on the Last Breath Huntcast, home of the Huntroversy. We're here to entertain, educate, and engage. And in case you didn't know, you only live once. But if you do it right, once is enough. Don't waste it.
All right, everyone. Welcome to Last Breath Huntcast. This is episode 163. We're starting to get into the numbers that are pretty good deer. You know, the 160s, 170s, 80s, and then we're getting into like some crazy numbers. But anywho, we're still trucking along on this in-season series on hopefully helping you guys out with some strategies that we use to kill the bucks on the farms that we hunt. So today, episode 163, again, Garrett's sitting here, Grant's across from me.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about a method that we've adopted about 5 years ago, and that's decoying deer. We're going to talk about the decoys that we use, how we use them, and really just kind of go over what we do to keep having success hunting with decoys. We know that this is a touchy subject. Some guys have had terrible experience with decoys, and we have too. But hopefully we can share with you some of our trials and tribulations. And if you decide to break out a decoy this year, you'll have the same amount of luck that we did. So before we get started, Mr. Putnam, pay the bills.
Yeah, this podcast is presented by none other than Badlands Gear. Using the code LASTBREATH22BL30, you can get 30% off site-wide at badlandsgear.com. I really enjoy all of the lifestyle type of wear that they make, and they even make it in a size tall. So I bought 4 different pairs of the Scree pant. Those are my favorite pants. And they have like blue, olive green, stone, and like a sand or tan color, and I wear those to work all the time. So if you want some real comfortable like pants with good amount of dexterity that are, pants that they're solid in color that you could wear, ground blind hunting or something like that during early season that won't rip or tear too easily when you're walking through briars and whatnots, you can get yourself a pair of the Scree pants or the Task pants. Those are also really nice.
And if you are like an all-American badass such as Mike Lemansky, you can order them with extra large crotch room for the big-ass balls that you have. I'm just kidding, but Mike Lemansky is a badass. I got to shout him out like every once in a while. You should check him out, Harvest Time Outdoors. He just bought a brand-new camera rig, and it's like,
whoop, whoop.
Sweet mother of Jesus. That thing should lay down some pretty good footage. Another great partner of ours is Moultrie Mobile. We've been running the Edge cameras this year. It's pretty crazy, the technology. They've got the auto connect feature, so you don't have to handicap yourself to a single network.
There's 2 buttons.
2 buttons. There's no SD card. It's literally an on-off and a connect. We've been running them and having a lot of great success with them. And lastly, we got to give a shout-out to the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Wayne Tompkins. Him and Michael over at Tompkins Taxidermy. If you guys kill a deer this year, you better head that direction. They are knocking out their deer in less than a year lead time still. They are not sacrificing 1 ounce speck or spick of quality. And gosh, the value that you get in the deer mounts, they're not the cheapest guy on the market. But somebody once said you can either have fast and cheap, or you can have good and fast, or you can't have a combination of these things. So with Wayne and with Michael, you guys are getting great quality at a fast turnaround, but you can't get it all at once. You can't get great quality and fast. You can't get great quality and cheap, but you can get great quality, and everything else that's involved. Great quality with fast, yes, but you can't get great quality and cheap, or vice versa. So Wayne and Michael, those guys, they've got a rocking website. You can call them anytime. Communication is fantastic. And speaking of how fantastic, we've taken a lot of deer over there because of a decoy. Specifically you, Mr. Putnam.
Yeah.
You were the decoy axe man. So
just lucky enough to be behind the bow when it happens. Because last year we could have killed 2 decoyed bucks with you, but they just were, probably 3-year-olds. That would have been really sweet, though. That one deer that we moved on that was like right on the fringe of being shootable. Yeah. That would have been really sweet. That would probably been one of our coolest whitetail moves up to date. Basically what we were sitting in a rut funnel. And we didn't bring the decoy that day. Across the farm, about a half a mile away, there was a buck that went past one of our cell cameras, and he must have been running when he was doing it because his antlers were we're like, all right, this is a bigger deer. Let's see if we can go call him out of that thicket. So we ran home, got the decoy. We're back up, hang and hunt in that tree within 50 minutes of us getting that cell camera picture. As sure shit. Right as rain, we we rattled. He came running right across the field into our lap to like 12 yards, and you could have killed him, multiple different shot opportunities had you wanted to. He just was probably sitting in that 3-year-old range. But he's a nice deer. That was a sweet encounter. But had that deer been a little bigger, that would have been
crazy.
Awesome. That would have been a crazy move to make to do that. So we do really enjoy using a decoy. Just a very blanket statement before we get going here, though. If you are a solo hunter, using a decoy can be challenging. So you need to in advance pack your pack, and the more things that you have going on, the harder it will be for you to carry and transport your decoy through the field. I would never want or condone. You can if you want. It's your hunt. You can always have that statement to fall back on, but I myself would never want to hang and hunt on a decoy hunt. That would be pretty miserable, carrying your stand and your bow and your climbing system and a decoy all in at the same time. That would be pretty heavy. And a decoy by nature, just because it's a large, irregular sized object, it's kind of awkward, especially carrying it through the woods. So I would use a decoy in the position where you've got like your stand pre-hung, either whether or not it's a permanent stand that sits there all year or not. I would make sure that you're not trying to do all that stuff in the morning, just because I feel like you're going to be covered in sweat and sitting in it all morning.
And you hit it best.
It's hard to do.
The decoys aren't heavy.
No.
It's just awkward. If you could condense the decoy down into a dumbbell, sure, you throw it in your pack or just carry it on your hand. But it's like, what do you do? Do you scoop it up with your arms, or we always throw it on our shoulder, right? Seems to be the best method. But I agree with you. I think... And we're not crazy cool hunters or anything like that, but I do think if you used a saddle, you could probably try to do the whole hang and hunt method, minimize what you got on your body and carrying. But
that's true.
But getting into it, talk about the evolution of the decoys that we've used, because it's a lot different from when we started.
Yeah, so you bought on clearance a long time ago a damaged Boss Buck decoy. Was that Flambeau that makes that?
Yes.
So that's one of those hollow shell plastic decoys. If they hit the ground, they're very loud and noisy. And you kind of get what you pay for, because we took that decoy and we upgraded to a Dave Smith decoy, and the difference in price there is about $500 or $600. And we understand that, but the decoy that we have now was a time investment, and we got to the point where that Flambeau decoy, because it's so light, because it's hollow, wasn't standing up to the wind very well. The system in which you put it on the ground is not the most convenient, especially during the time when the ground is frozen. That is one very, very nice thing to note about the Dave Smith decoy we have. There is about a 2 foot by 2 foot platform stand that you sit on top of the ground, and then you put your decoy rod and post into that, and then your decoy fixes to that. So you're not driving a stake in like a Flambeau decoy or a one of those really lightweight decoys. So that's one thing that I really like about it. In terms of the decoy itself, we just got to the point where we were wanting to use a decoy so much that we wanted one that was the right size, the right shape, and had all the features that we wanted, just to make it more realistic. And so that Boss Buck decoy, not to bash Flambeau, like when you buy an $80 decoy, you're going to get what you pay for, versus a $700 decoy. I would, for the same reason why I'm expecting a Maven pair of binoculars to be better than Bushnell. It's not that Bushnell makes a bad pair of optics. It's that if you buy a $200 pair of binoculars versus a $600 pair, if the $600 pair isn't better, then you might be dumb.
Right.
So that's kind of the analogy that I'll use there. So we took that, and we noticed that we really liked hunting with a decoy because of the opportunities for us to be more vocal with our calls and really paint a better picture of a fighting scenario and lure a dominant buck in during the rut. That's why we use it. And so we started doing that. About 10 years ago is when you got that thing. But we started really, really refining this practice about 5 or 6 years ago, to the point where we've killed 5 bucks with them now and have a pretty good system. So now we have a Dave Smith DSD decoy we named Tyson, and he sits much lower to the ground. He looks to me like a postured up 3-year-old decoy, and his, the fur etched into the plastic, like into the, I wouldn't even call it plastic.
It's like soft.
It's like a soft,
or I guess a hard rubber.
Yeah. It's molded, and it's not clunky. It doesn't fall down very easily, and it can stand up to the wind really well because of that stand system that I mentioned.
We've never had it fall, actually.
Yep. And so It stands a little bit better. Its ears are more realistic. You can pivot the ears to point them backwards, and its horns, everything about it is better. And it stands up to the elements quite a bit better than the Boss Buck decoy. For instance, when rain hits the back of the Boss Buck decoy, it kind of sounds like,
and it shines,
and it's loud, it's shiny, whereas the Dave Smith decoy is more of a dull look to kind of match its surroundings. It's more flat than
textured,
highly sheened. So that's the decoy that we physically have. And we know that it's a cost investment to get one of those, but put yourself on like a little payment plan, if you will. Save for the next 2 years. You take all your paychecks, you put, $50 into an account. You can afford one pretty quickly by doing that, and you'll have one in a couple of years if this is something that you're interested in doing. But we, again, concede that it is a lot of work to get one in and out of the field. But if you can use the strategies we're about to go over in unison with a good quality decoy, we feel like there's opportunities for you to get bucks really in tight to you, especially with archery equipment.
I think it's important to note too, like these are not endorsed. We paid full price for our Dave Smith.
Yep.
And so this is a wholehearted recommendation. I think the biggest thing when you're looking at a decoy to use, specifically a buck decoy, to trigger that fight response, to prompt them to come to the decoy, to posture up, to give you that shot opportunity. The only thing you have going for you is the decoy. Yep. It has to paint the realistic image so that deer comes in. It has to have the right size. It has to have the right posture. It has to have the right color, the correct sheen. So when you start looking at all of these elements, there are several manufacturers of deer decoys, buck decoys, and it's not like there's a plethora. You've got your two-dimensional Montana decoys. Reinhardt came out with one. Flambeau has one. Dave Smith has one. There's a couple other smaller companies that have them out there. But, at the end of the day, I guess you have to ask yourself a question. If you decide that you want a decoy hunt and you take the plunge and buy one, what is it worth for you to have an opportunity at that deer? If you have one of these other decoys, which we've used in the past, and you have a bad result with it, you're going to be pissed because you still spent money and then you spooked the deer or the deer never came in, right? So, just again, through trial and error, through using other decoys, and for having really great experience with Dave Smith decoys, we decided to make the decision and take the plunge, make the payment, and carry that sucker in and out in the first several days of November. And boy, we've had some pretty cool hunts because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So getting into your decoy, you have the decoy, it's sitting in your garage, and you are ready to deploy it in the field. Here are kind of a checklist of the scenarios that we try to get the decoy in. I say we because you have to use the decoy kind of as a teammate and a team member. So when you're using a decoy, you have to be cognizant your senses have to be heightened about the wind direction, about your ground scent more than they ever have, because you can't be just tromping all over your decoy spread. Like, everything has to be right. And the scenarios that we're about to share with you, if you can check off more of the boxes, the decoy itself will be more effective. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was topography. Many times when you and I use a decoy, it is not in the middle of a several hundred acre flat as a pancake field. The decoy terrain that I feel like is best to use is on rolling terrain, same as a turkey reaper decoy, because you can get what is called into the bubble. Into the bubble is kind of like the phrase that Garrett and I use to maintain the idea that when an animal is in the bubble where they feel like they're in a fight or flight response type of scenario, and we want to elicit a fight type of response. So if you are a person that sees a fight going across the parking lot in Hy-Vee that's 400 or 500 yards away, you can kind of sit back for a moment or two and make the decision on whether or not you want to involve yourself. Now, if that's happening, if you pull into your spot and there's two people going at it right at the back of your truck, around your tailgate, now you really have a decision to make quickly. And we like to put ourselves in a scenario where we're making bucks pick and they don't have an option. Where their option is only fight, because they feel like, whoa, there's a stranger in my house, he surprised me.
Or I've called them in, like they're coming in to check out a rattle sequence, and it's like, boom, there it is.
There he is.
And you have to understand, too, the time of year that we're using this, it's instinctive in their nature to pick that. Their testosterone levels are the highest that it's going to be all season long. They have that drive to breed and to mate. They have that drive to push other bucks out of the territory. So on top of that, it's not like we're trying to change their personality. No, like we're using Mother Nature against them in this scenario, right? They're already heightened. They're already looking for a fighter. They've been fighting.
Yep.
Now I think the big thing is we don't give them the opportunity to assess the situation. It's not like as he's walking across the field, like you said, 400 yards away, he's watching the decoy the whole time where he's going, you know what? That guy hasn't moved the whole time. No, it's he comes out of a roll or up out of a waterway and he's like 80 yards away and he's like, there he is. That's the guy. And immediately, like more times than not, when the deer we call in see our decoy, they are posturing within 10 seconds of seeing the decoy. And they're sidestepping, they're licking their lips, they're pinning their ears. Like it's a scenario where you just said it. We're forcing them to choose the fight or flight, and given the time of the year and the deer that we're calling in, we have prompted fight almost every time.
Yeah, and so it's a legitimate scenario. Like envision this, right? You've got a couple 100-acre field with rolls in it. If you are set up in your tree stand, we are under the belief that we would rather position our decoy to the point where it's close to a roll that we're expecting a buck to come out of, or close to a tree line that's got a good amount of edge cover on it, so that way a buck, when he's coming up a hill, down a hill, or he can't see, our visual breakup is almost concealing the decoy for the most part. That is the best bang for your buck scenario. If you can get, especially if you're on a high point and you have the decoy with you on the high point, and a large percentage of deer that were to enter a field cannot see that high point or can't see up to the top of that knob, that is the scenario in which we have had the most success with a decoy, because a deer, they hear a sound, they're going to go investigate. They casually stroll up the hill to investigate the sound. Now all of a sudden they see a deer that's popping that bubble right as soon as they get to the top of that hill that's 80, 60 yards away from them. Now they feel like they have to fight. So using the topography would be our first step and our first tip for you, is using the natural rolls or hills. Another thing would be many fields across America that hunters are hunting over are not a perfect square. Some of you guys that are using a perfect square, that's totally fine. This can work in there as well, but we like hiding on the backside of fingers with our decoy. So that way, if there's a deer that comes that can't see in the little cove that we're in, we'll tend to pick a smaller section of field to do this in rather than out in the wide open. So that way when a deer wheels around that curve after we've made our noise, boom, there it is again. We're trying to pop the bubble. And we feel like this is especially an effective tactic in fields that are like 5 acres or less in size, because the entire field is a bubble depending on where you're at, because the field size is just smaller. If you're hunting a 5-acre field, many of the ones that we're hunting are, 80 yards wide by 200 yards long. So if we're somewhere in the middle of that, more likely than not, the deer is going to see that decoy almost immediately upon entering and will be in the bubble again. So if you use those 3 tactics, use the topography on the edge of a finger or a small cove by hiding the decoy, or number 3, just using a smaller food plot to do this in with a good amount of edge cover around it, you can conceal the decoy and get yourself into a scenario where the decoy will best work for you. Because you're reminder on who you're trying to kill here. You're trying to kill a wise old mature buck who's, wary by nature. But if you can take that ability of them to be wary away from them and not give them ample time to make a decision, like that's like decision making 101, even for people. Like if you take the best decision makers on planet Earth, even the most logical people on Earth, and give them less time, they're gonna probably have a better odds of making a poor decision.
Correct.
Same with the deer.
And I think so. Now we'll talk about where we set the decoy up. This is a lot different. We do not practice this principle only when we're hunting a decoy, but we always put the decoy downwind of us. We plan to shoot our deer in our scent cone.
Yep.
Yes. So we do this for 2 big reasons. The first big reason is that most bucks, and like Grant said, mature deer want to circle downwind. They just, it's in their nature, it's in their instinct. And so they're going to try to anyway. And the second reason is, let's give it to him. Let's make this really inviting for him. So we'll put our decoy close in proximity to us. We are usually in the timber already, so we do not believe on hanging our stands right out there, bare naked ladies on the face of the field edge. We're probably tucked in 5 yards or so, 10, 15 feet. We'll put that decoy so he's maybe 10 yards from the field edge, so that we have about a 15 to 18 yard buffer in between us and the decoy. The decoy is in quartering hard to us. And we do this because most deer, when they approach this decoy, most bucks, they posture and they sidestep. That's not going to be a head-on approach. Some of them do, and if they do, you've got a quartering away shot. But more times than not, we have noticed and we have shot these deer that are like bristled up, rolled shoulders, head cocked, sidestepping in. And by quartering that deer hard to you, you're going to give yourself a better opportunity at a broadside shot.
Yeah, they're going to try to come in on the inverse of the way you face the deer. So if the decoy is quartered hard to you, well, the opposite of quartering to is quartered away. And that's the best shot you could take with archery equipment, is a 15 to 18, 20 yard chip quartering away shot, and bury it right behind, in the middle of the ribs there. And they're going to
And so then
smoked.
The half of the other side of that is that by putting that decoy 15 to 18 yards away from you, if that deer decides to circle downwind, which we have had a lot of times, they're usually going to do that about 5 yards away. They'll give themselves a 10, 15 yard buffer between themselves and the decoy. So now you have a 25 yard shot at that deer with that same type of broadside postured up or quartering away shot. And the thing is like we said, is very important. We have that decoy directly downwind of us. So our windows, our gaps to shoot are going to be, behind the decoy, and more importantly, in front of the decoy. You do not, when you place that decoy out, you do not need to have a shot at that decoy. If the deer's at your decoy, it's too late. He's blowing it up or he's smelling it and out of there. So it's really important to note that, like, we want to give the deer the wind, because the deer, and this has been our experience with dozens of bucks, they don't go downwind and straight to the decoy. They'll get about 50 yards or closer, and then they'll start to make their little parabola march around it, to start posturing up and quartering to it. And they really don't begin to circle around them until, like we said, they're 10 to 20 feet, 30 feet away from that decoy, essentially 2 to 5, 10 yards from that decoy to circle downwind, well within bow range if you manipulate your decoy into this response. So when you pick your stand, we're hunting with the decoy downwind of us. We're giving the deer our wind, but it's because they want to go downwind of it. And we're making sure to place it so that deer, whether he comes in front of the decoy, it's damn sure a chip shot, or if he goes behind the decoy, it's not a stretch at all.
So talking about shot distance, typically our decoy is about at the 15 yard mark. So like you said, if they swing deep, and we did have a deer swing deep that forced us to take a 40 yard shot, but it was still manageable. We're practicing, every day for 50 or 60 yards so that those 40 yard shots are doable. So if you have your decoy at 25 or 30 and he circles downwind, then that's going to be pushing your range. And both of us kind of feel the way that we don't really want to take a shot that's over 40 yards.
We can, but we don't want to. Right.
We can, but we don't want to. We would rather have that deer that's on alert anyway not be able to jump the string too bad. And so by positioning your decoy at that 15 yard mark, if they swing downwind by 10 yards, they're at 25, still a doable shot. If they spin and wheel in closer to this field edge that you're hung on, then shoot, you're going to get an 10 yard shot. That's even better, right?
Yeah.
And so another thing about proximity, when that deer locks onto that decoy, one of the best parts of it, it's also one of the worst parts, is that you have the luxury of getting away with a bit of movement, because not only are you above them, typically in a tree stand, their concentration, their focus is not leaving that decoy. Once they start sidestepping, especially, they're locked in on that decoy and they're going in for a fight. They're not going to be paying attention to you as much. So you have a little bit of grace on
drawing,
moving,
moving,
on what the wind's doing, because the situation is painted so well for that deer. And in that situation, you get away with a little bit more. But, and we talked about this when we discussed this with Jake on his podcast, be prepared for that deer to be putting the blinders totally on. Of the 5 deer we've killed on a decoy, this has only happened one time. Typically, we'll stop them between 3 and 5 yards away from the decoy, but one buck in particular, a deer we called K2, he did not stop after 4 times of me trying to stop him. And
he was
even at
so
the point,
focused.
He was so focused. So know that sometimes, especially if they're in tight to you and they're dead locked in on that decoy, sometimes they may ignore you when you're trying to stop them. So anticipate the shot. For instance, the lesson that I learned that day that we killed K2 was, I want to make sure that instead of positioning myself for I like hitting a deer 3 to 5 inches behind the shoulder, like a double lung. If I had to draw my perfect position to kill a deer, that's where I want to aim. That's where I feel like it's the most forgiving shot for me to take. However, depending on the way the deer is, moving through your sight picture and your shooting lane here, you may want to hug that shoulder a little tighter, and not make the mistake that I did, because if he continues to walk that whole time, even though they're in pretty close, you may have a shot that ends up being further back that you want on his body cavity, just because he doesn't put the blinders on and stop.
Right.
But that's only been the case 1 out of 5 times for us. All the other deer, we've been able to stop them.
But I agree, though, just like you said, it is important to note when that deer commits to the decoy, you have some grace. You have some forgivingness. Don't be afraid to draw your bow. Oh crap, I didn't, because you don't want to draw back when he's 50 yards away sidestepping. That'll take a long time for him to get in. Know that you have that forgivingness to maybe spin a little bit on your chair, to draw your bow back and settle in and not have to worry about it. Because just like you said, they're completely fixed on that decoy. And know that if you don't stop them soon enough, they will blow it up and your hunt's over. I've seen Michael Hunsucker once where the deer blew up the decoy and it came back like, what the heck's going on? He did get a shot, but I wouldn't count on that. Yeah, I would not count on that.
Typically when I see a deer decoy get blown up online or on a hunting show, it's over at that point.
Yeah.
So make sure you try to maybe if you can, if your shooting window allows, try to stop them. Try to begin stopping them about 10 yards away.
Right.
So that way, if they do what the buck I mentioned said, you still have a little bit of time. Do not. I would highly recommend not trying to stop a deer when it's 3 yards away from the decoy. Because at that point, he's getting ready to lurch. He's getting ready to spring forward like a linebacker and shoulder that decoy. So I would start your stopping procedure about 10, 12 yards away before he gets the decoy, in anticipation of it taking 1 or 2 mats to stop the deer in your shooting window.
But do not stop him before your shot.
That goes without
saying, but yes. So let's talk about a big reason why we like running decoys, and that's, as Grant said earlier, the ability to be aggressive with calls and to be vocal. So the time frame that we'll use a decoy from about October 20th through the beginning of November, and I mean like the first 4 days in November. But really it's going to fall down much more narrowly within the last couple days of October and the first couple days in November. That time where bucks are super, super fired up. Maybe they've bred a first doe. They're starting to stretch their legs, and then maybe they're even bouncing between does. That's when we find that these deer are most susceptible to decoying and calling. We prefer to do more blind calling, actually almost all of our blind calling, when we have a decoy, because we have the audible response. Then when a deer comes in, they have the visual response as well. But that being said, we've also had fantastic opportunity with sight calling. As hunting in ag country where you do have these fields, a big deer, if you rattle to him across the field, he cuts down through a waterway, pops up 100 yards from your position, and you can see that finger. He's going to be like, there's no deer here. Maybe he'll cross to see if those deer are in the timber, but maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's like, you know what? Not today.
Yep.
That's where the decoy steps into play. It allows us to rattle, to grunt, and most importantly, snort wheeze with extreme effectiveness with archery equipment. So we use all 3 of those regularly to bring these bucks within bow range, but it's important to notice that it really allows you to blind call and then have that recertification, that reinsertion there of a confirmation, okay, that deer is here. So when that buck comes in, he has that visual confirmation and he can approach. And then counterintuitively, K2 was a deer that we just talked about that was hyper-focused. We saw him cutting across from one patch of timber to another through a field. He was trotting, tried grunting at him, didn't work, tried rattling, he didn't hear me. So I snort wheeze at him. Boom, he put on the brakes. He whipped his head. Since he was stopped, I rattled a short sequence, just a smash and bang, and like a string, dude, that deer took off down the waterway, came back up and over, and as soon as he saw the decoy, everything he heard clicked. It processed, right? And right over he came. It's a scenario that allows you to do both sight calling and blind calling and get away with it.
Yes, exactly. And talking about the scenarios in terms of the wind direction, we mentioned that we give the deer the wind. We do not typically do this when we're bow hunting. We try to either get in a position where the deer is so far beneath us where we think his path of travel is going to be that our scent's blowing over top, or we give him just a little bit of like a quartering wind. But we try our best to keep our scent concealed from the deer that we're hunting. But in this particular scenario, we are giving the deer the wind on the silver platter, but we're giving it to them in the moment that we can kill them. And so our best decoy spot is set up for a south wind. And so for the last few Novembers, we've killed on a south wind just because it's been a hot November. But we would recommend setting your decoy up, like Garrett said, downwind of that. So pay attention to your wind direction, and it's okay in this scenario to give the deer your wind when they get into the position of your shooting lane. So typically we will try to run our decoy on the far edge of our scent cone, where, like you said, if your decoy is in the middle of your shooting lane, we would advise against that. We never do that. We put it right on the edge to give you a full window, because we feel like, all right, let's say you're set up for a 20-yard shot, and at the distance of 20 yards, you have 8 yards laterally of shooting lane, and you put your decoy in the middle of it. Well, if you divide 8 yards at 25 by 2, you have 4 yards on that side of the decoy. And if, like we said, if you're trying to stop a deer 3-4 yards away, it's pretty much too late at that point. They're getting ready to spring, and they're getting ready to bolt into that decoy. And so put it on one side or the other of your shooting lane that allows them to catch the wind when they're opening into your shooting lane, and not before they get there. So it's okay to give the deer the wind. The other thing about that is your ground scent. So walk a very straight line between where you're going to put your deer, your decoy, and your stand, and return on that same path of travel. Try your best, if you have this mapped out in your head before, try your best not to tromp around the field that you're setting your decoy up in. Try to make one straight line there and back, so that way, if that deer's coming in a spot that you aren't perceiving, that still you only have one path of travel of ground scent to and from the decoy that's on the far edge of the scent cone that you're anticipating the deer coming into. For instance, if you have a perfectly straight south wind, you have a shooting lane, put the decoy on the west side of your scent cone, so that way when the deer comes into the east side of your scent cone and catches your southerly wind, you have time to shoot him. And also your ground scent going from your stand is walking that western edge of your scent cone, not the eastern one.
Right.
To give them a double whammy of like, okay, I smell something on the ground, also smell something in the air. Now I'm nervous. Now I put the brakes on, because we have had that happen as well before with Twix.
Yeah, and I think the last thing, talking about scent, I'm glad that you brought up that ground scent thing, is that people ask us, do we run buck urine or doe estrus? No, we typically don't. The only time that we would use any type of scent in conjunction with a decoy would be if we have the luxury of harvesting a deer several days beforehand, where we will remove the hocks off of that buck and place them on the ground next to the decoy. But we don't use any artificial or any supplemented scents, because we're not trying to bring that deer in through his nose. I'm trying to use his eyes and his ears to bring him in. I don't need scent. So that's the last thing.
I feel like that's the hardest scent to beat on a whitetail. Like their number one superpower is their nose. And
Absolutely.
And where our decoy is stored, like it's stored in your shed. It's a nice watertight environment where it's in a climate controlled. It's not rotting by the sun. It's not getting nibbled on by mice. It's a great place for it to be. But regardless, it smells
hang out
like
in there. I park my truck in there.
All the odors that we have in there.
Yep, all those secondary, tertiary odors that you just can't eliminate. So,
so we don't even try to fight that battle.
No. But again, decoys are a ton of fun. I think that if you use them correctly, you'll have some really cool hunts. I mean, yes, we've killed 5 deer using decoys. We've had opportunities at dozens of deer using decoys. Not necessarily that we didn't capitalize on them, but deer that we weren't ready to harvest yet. And that's our decision, right? But I mean, I think that once you call in one of those deer and you have them posture up and their ears are pinned back and they look, twice as big because they're bristled and they're licking their lips, like that type of hunting experience is really cool. And once you figure out that special recipe, and you'll find these spots on your farms where you can do this, where you have a lot of sight, but you're not giving the deer that line of sight that you have because you're up in the tree. Like, it's one of those techniques that you'll use for the first couple days of November almost every year, and you'll just, whether you call in a deer that you're going to shoot, or maybe a younger 3 or 4 year old, or a deer that you just don't want to harvest,
it's a ton of fun.
It's still a ton of fun. So, as we progress along on this series, something we forgot to say, you can shoot Grant or I either a message on our Instagrams, on our Facebooks. You just reach out to us if you have questions furthermore about any of these tactics, whether it's scrape hunting, decoy hunting, stand placement. We're always here to help. Fire us a message, shoot us a DM, tag us in a post. We're happy to help. Throw a quote up or throw a message up in the inner circle. We're going to be there to try to make you as better or as good of a hunter as we can physically and personally. So on that note, that's decoy hunting in a nutshell, man. And if you get the chance to decoy in a buck and throw an arrow through him, I think you'll be hooked. But
Yep. Getting out of that and into one more topic, I do feel like, and this is totally on you, it's your tag, not ours, we tend to call a lot more of that 3, 4, sometimes 5-year-old deer in using the decoy method. Those older, wary bucks that don't necessarily want to pick a fight, we don't call as many of those deer. And so be prepared for a couple 3-year-olds to bristle up and come sniffing around. And if they're big enough, then put the axe to them. But I just wanted to make you aware, like you had said, just because we've killed a handful of bucks using this technique doesn't mean we've had a lot more bucks between 5 and 20 yards right in our lap for the shooting. We just haven't capitalized on it. So this is a very effective technique, especially in early November, like Garrett said. So getting into that, ending this podcast anyway, going to finish with the would you rather. Let's say hypothetically Illinois' deer season started September 1st and ended on January 31st, or whatever the last day of January is. Is it 31st? Let's say that it was that long. Starts in September, ends in January. Would you rather use a decoy in September or January if, our state season had shifted? So 2 times that aren't necessarily September. Great for using it. Really?
Deer have been hunted and beat around, and in late January, they're so freaking wary. They're herded up too. All it would take is for one doe to get downwind of that decoy and your hunt's over. So your chance of calling in a deer in September,
lower,
not likely, but I think they'd be more accepting of a decoy then.
A little more tolerant. Okay. That's probably what I would say too. I mean, shoot, if you're in January, you're hunting over in a late season food plot, you get one wary doe. It's about 1 out of every 3 or 4 deer we encounter. Comes to the field edge, sees that thing, blows, runs. All the deer in the staging area run.
My tactic with a decoy in January would be totally different. Like, I would want a feeding
doe.
And I would put it really close to the blind. So like a deer comes in, it's like, oh, somebody else is here. Oh, it's neat. Safe.
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't want to be running like a postured buck decoy in January.
Yeah. That's a good point. On that note, we're going to go ahead and shut her down. We will see you next week. in episode 164. Thank you again for listening to the Last Breath Huntcast and our decoy hunting strategy. Till next time, good luck in the woods. Don't waste it.